I wanted to give you, this is a public service announcement. I want to give you a warning. Love hurts. Okay. For me, let me see if this is the form that takes. My wife and I, we've given up campground hosting with some of the things that kept us from having a dog. We always had dogs in the past. So we went to the Kansas City Pet Project shelter to find a shelter dog. We were looking, because we have a 1-bedroom condo, we were looking for 25 to 30 pound dogs. Sweet little thing here with 32 pounds, a little bit undernourished. We thought, they said they thought 8 to 9 months old. We thought probably pretty close to done growing. Okay. I think they were wrong. She is now a solid 47 pounds of muscle. And I mean seriously strong for a girl. There is no dog at the doggy park that in any way comes close to taking advantage of her. She is stronger than the pit bulls, the Dobermans, the whatever those Marmaduke dogs are, Great Danes. She has them all running scared. I can't lift my arm above my shoulders now, thanks to a little patch of ice and a strong tug from her. I have to keep ice on my right knee. So a word of advice: if you find yourself, as we did, as older people at the shelter looking for a shelter dog, make sure it's got gray hair, because this one's about to kill me. Okay. Okay, so tonight's discussion is going to be about police, and I want to say something up front. I grew up in Emporia, and I worked in Emporia for the school district for a long time in the central office. I knew, when my kids were growing up, I knew every single police officer here. My kids used to get just furious with me because every time that we were out and we saw one of them, I'm like, "Hey, Rick, I want you to meet my kids. This is Rick Freeberg, a good friend of mine. This is Lane Rhino, a good friend of mine, blah, blah, blah." Okay. And my daughter was like, "You don't have to keep introducing us to every single police officer." I'm like, "Yes, I do." And I personally I worked for 3.5 years at Jackson County Jail as a paramedic. I also did some work in California when I was in the Navy. We used to do some side work as paramedics with San Diego County, just as PRN. We weren't firefighters. We were mostly extra hands on the responding crews. I was either taking vital signs or writing down the vital signs that I took. But I've been around law enforcement for a long time, and I have a great deal of respect for law enforcement. And I truly believe that most people who go into law enforcement do it for the right reasons. However, that being said, we have an integrity problem right now in law enforcement and policing in America. And I want to address something that I don't see addressed by the media reports when they talk about Laquan McDonald, George Floyd, or recently Tyree Nichols. Okay. And that is paper. So I call this police paper whipping. Now, for those of you who don't know, paper whipping is the process by which you use documents to record actions that you, in fact, did not take. Okay. I love watching air crash investigation shows. And this is a real problem. About half the shows ends up being some maintenance guy didn't do maintenance, but wrote down that he did. And then the plane crashes. And then through the process of investigation, they discovered that. That's called paper whipping. We used to do it in the military. I was in a unit attached to the Marine Corps, a Navy unit of corpsmen attached to the Marine Corps. There were 5 of us in my unit that was supporting about 450 Marines. There was no way we had time for all of us to go through all the training to be ready to deploy. So I got sent to trainings to the instructor basic school so that I could train all of us about all the things we needed to be ready to deploy. Now, we did it. We were working our butts off all the time, supporting there were 4 or 5 different actual Marine Corps units that we supported. And so, you know, if we were out doing whatever, then I came back and I documented that we had trained on casualty transportation, because that's, you know, we were out transporting people. Okay, whatever it was, that's paper whipping. So I've been involved in this on both sides. Okay, but I feel like this is the unseen threat to policing in America. Okay, we're going to talk primarily about two occurrences. First is George Floyd. You'll remember George Floyd was a young man who was breaking the law, and I don't want to pretend like he wasn't. He was breaking the law. He was behaving inappropriately. For one thing, trying to pass counterfeit checks, and then did get belligerent with the police. There's no doubt about that. We've all seen the video. Okay. This is I went to the Minneapolis Police Department and I looked at the actual police report that was filed that night for the incident. This is how it starts. On the scene, 38 straight reporting that there's been a male down at the back. The next portion of the report, a huge portion of the report, completely redacted. Absolutely nothing shared with the public. However, the next day, this was shared. So this first part actually describes almost exactly what the report said, that there was an occurrence, blah, blah, blah. And then it gets down here and talks about the officers arriving. It says here, officers were able to get the suspect into handcuffs and noted he appeared to be experiencing medical distress. Officers called for an ambulance. Now, we know that that's not true because we've now seen the videos. What I'd like to make you aware of is that the detective who worked with the PAO to prepare this statement had seen the videos prior to the statement being released. Okay, so he knew that Derek Chauvin was on his neck, that Officer Tao was on his back, and I can't remember the third officer who had his legs pinned. And then the fourth officer was keeping people back, including a firefighter EMT who was trying to get in to provide medical assistance. Kept them back. Laquan McDonald, I don't know if you remember him. He was a 17-year-old young man, again, breaking the law. Very clearly breaking the law. He was wielding a knife. People in a business area, people called the police and said there's this guy who's kind of crazy wielding a knife. This again straight out of the police report. I went to the Chicago police records and got this straight out of the police report. So the narrative beat 815. That's actually a patrol car that has two officers in it. Okay. Thomas Gaffney is the one who was identified in court in this police record. And I think that's because he was driving. I think the cars were, the first officer listed was the driver. And you can read all that stuff. I'll be happy to make this available. But what happened is this young man had a knife. The police arrived, he kind of ran from the police, and he ended up on a flyover on a highway. Okay. Now, if you've seen the video, which I trust most of us have, what happens is he's standing there. There's several officers standing around. They're all at least 15 feet away, at least. He's got a knife in his hand. He's not waving it at anybody. He's not threatening anybody, but he doesn't drop it. Okay. And the officers are clearly yelling at him to drop the knife. He does not drop the knife, and he should. I'm not trying to say he shouldn't. Beat 845 is the car that had Jason Van Dyke in it. Jason Van Dyke, if you saw the video, literally right on the scene, got out of his car and cranked 14 rounds into Laquan McDonald, killing him. This is what, and again, this is the report that was released after the supervisors had viewed everything. Okay, including the dash cam that we all saw. The offender refused verbal commands and continued to approach the officers while still armed with his knife. Beat 845, fearing for his life, discharged his weapon. Now, again, Laquan McDonald never moved towards Jason Van Dyke, never. He did not drop the knife. We're not going to pretend that he did. He did not drop the knife. But in the report, there were 3 victims listed. The 2 officers in beat 815 and Jason Van Dyke, who was listed as injured by the offender in the report. And again, we saw the video. No one was injured by the offender. Okay, no one. So the U.S. Justice Department works hard to try to protect policing in America. And they do that by opening what are called patterns and practices investigations. Okay, so in other words, they want to go in when they're asked, when people complain, we think there's a problem in Chicago, we think there's a problem in Minneapolis, we think there's a problem in Memphis. Thank you. I was reaching for that one. We think there's a problem, then the U.S. Civil Rights Division will open a pattern and practices investigation. And that's where they go in and they start to look at things like, does the paperwork match the video? And if it doesn't, then why not? And if it doesn't, then what can they do to make it match in the future? And the solution is generally called a consent decree. I personally, when I was working at a Jackson County jail in downtown Kansas City, I was a part of a consent decree. I was part of the solution. They had so many injuries and deaths of inmates at the hands of correctional officers, sometime well in advance of when I went to work there, that the U.S. Justice Department, in conjunction with the U.S. District Court, developed a consent decree that the Jackson County jail administrators and the Jackson County legislators agreed to. And that was that they would have an independent outside group of medical personnel there to ensure the safety of the inmates. And I was one of them. I was a paramedic. A bunch of us ex-Navy guys working in the clinic. Okay. Every single time that they had a physical interaction with an inmate, somebody who was causing problems, they called us. And one of us went in with them. You know, we didn't engage, we didn't help them, except for a couple of desperate situations. One time when a young man tried to get through the door that I was heading into, I ended up handcuffed to him. But for the most part, we just watched. And one time, I had to report that a correctional officer abused an inmate. Out of 3.5 years, one time. And in that 3.5 years, there was one other paramedic who had to make a similar report. So I would argue the consent decree did a pretty darn good job. Okay.
Did you suffer any retaliation for making that report by the corrections officer?
The individual correction officer who I reported threatened me personally, but was fired shortly after that. And I never saw him again. So it was a pretty serious. I have to admit, I was a little shaky that night when I drove home. Okay. Because had he made good on his threat, he was certainly physically capable of doing that. Anyway, one of the problems that we have in policing in the United States is that we don't track police officer violence. This is sort of the blue shield, as they say. Okay, we don't track it. So what happens is that the police get away with it more times than not. Now, understand, this is a tough job. I mean, the police are walking into violence often, okay? And it's, it's hard not to respond with violence if that's what's happening at the moment, okay? And I've been there, okay? I've been in the room as this is happening. And the number of times that I watched an inmate fight and flail and scratch and bite and do everything they could while the officers were treating them just as well as they could while still needing to get them restrained. And then the inmate sees me and says, "Those guys just jumped me." I'm like, "No, they didn't. I've been here the whole time." Okay. Too bad. Okay. So I totally understand the problem that exists, that if I'm walking into a situation, if I'm a police officer with my uniform and all the paraphernalia, that automatically there's tension. In a lot of cases, there's violence. And I'm as a police officer, that's the police officer's job, is to address that. I totally understand that. However, the U.S. Justice Department actually did a study, police integrity loss, the study of law enforcement officers arrested. Now, understand that a lot of officers don't ever get accused, much less arrested. So what we're looking at are probably arguably the most egregious situations. Okay, so they did the study from 2006 to 2015. The report was received in 2016. It was not published other than made available online. I've read the entire report. It's a fascinating read if you want to get it. I've read all of these, by the way, and all of these are 30 or 40 pages long. The police reports, all of that stuff. I mean, it goes literally, they have the logs of every single radio call that's involved in all of the exchanges. And so you really you got to dig in to find the stuff that you're looking for. But this is a fascinating read. So this is in the abstract. This is the line that I thought just really jumped out at me. Surprisingly little is known about crimes by law enforcement officers because they protect each other. And again, I understand that if we were talking about this at dinner, if Bob and I are going to go into that house where there's domestic violence, I got to know Bob got my back. If he just ratted me out, I'm not sure that I'm going to have his back. Okay, I'm going to just let Bob go in there and deal with it alone. So what they discovered in this study of 9 years, and granted, this is just 9 years, okay? They break it down into these types of categories: sex-related crimes, alcohol-related crimes, drug-related crimes, violence, and profit-motivated crimes. Clearly, the number 1 and 2 were violence-related crimes and alcohol-related crimes. That accounted for more than half of the police officers who were arrested. And well over half of those police officers who were arrested were off duty. These were domestic occurrences. So the very popular, the one that make the news, Derek Chauvin and Jason Van Dyke and those in the 5 members of the Scorpion unit, those who make the news are kind of the exception. Most of the officers who get arrested are arrested in their own homes while off duty, or they're arrested on the streets driving drunk. That's the 2 primary ways that they get arrested. The least, by the way, is profit-motivated crime. This is refreshing to hear that. Okay, we're not Mexico. Okay, which I don't pay attention to the news lately. Things are getting ugly in Mexico. So the findings that they got, that they came up with, first of all, is that police crimes are not uncommon. Now, again, most of what I've read says that probably fewer than 5% of officers are involved in this, in the actual commission of crimes. But you see the numbers. There's probably more people arrested than we care to think about. Now, I would like to point out that these are the officers who are arrested. This is Derek Chauvin. It's not any of the officers involved in the reporting. It's Jason Van Dyke. It's not any of the 15 officers who wrote reports that said Jason Van Dyke was at risk of being injured, or the detective who wrote that he was in fact injured. Okay, none of those people were arrested. None of those officers were disciplined. Well, excuse me, some were disciplined, none were arrested. Okay. Second, police crime is occupationally derived. And we talked about that. If I'm going to go and deal with a violent person, I'm going to deal with that generally with violence. Okay. Sort of, it works in the movies for Paul Newman to put his hat on sideways and act goofy and talk some guy out of doing something violent. That works really well in the movies. You know, it's just like the police never run out of gas in the movies either. Okay. In real life, it doesn't work. Okay. So in real life, police work is conducive to all sorts of criminal behavior because there's a lot of opportunity for it. Okay. And one of the things that I think sometimes doesn't talk about, partly because it's clearly not evident in these cases that make the news, but there's an adrenaline rush. If any of you have ever hunted before, that buck that walks into your sights for the very first time, you cannot control the rest of your body. Like your eyeball sees it perfectly. Nothing else works. Okay, that's buck fever. Okay. And that's what happens a lot of times to police officers. Now, quite frankly, some of it's a good thing. Like they need that adrenaline, they need that rush in order to deal with the physicality that they're going to go through. Okay. But as we all know, when you get that rush, you also get tunnel vision. You stop thinking. Okay. You get focused on one thing. Okay. So it's also something that brings airplanes down, by the way. Third, police crime is complex and multivariate. They can be alcohol-related, drug, and in fact, a lot of times, more than one of these are involved. The number of times in domestic abuse, police arrest, when police officers are arrested for domestic abuse, alcohol or drugs is almost always involved. So there's, again, a sort of multiple opportunities. Call to action. Those of you who read our articles know that we like to end with a call for action. So the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act, which was HB 1280 in the last Congress, so we're not sure it's going to carry through or if it's going to become a different bill. But one of the things that this does is it holds officers accountable for their reporting. Okay, so it requires that if there's an incident of violence while on patrol, that it be reported through police reports, and that those reports are shared with the Department of Justice. And that gives us data, because the reality is we have no data. Okay, we have this one study that covered 9 years that worked only on newspaper reports. It literally combed through the newspaper reports and said, oh, this guy's a police officer and he got arrested for domestic violence. So we don't have police reports that say this officer was arrested for domestic violence, or this officer was engaged in something that we know because the video doesn't match the report and led to the death of a suspect, was inappropriate behavior. Okay. So the George Floyd Act has that component in it, that it literally holds the officers accountable, not just for their actions, for following the law, enforcing the law, but for reporting accurately what happens. And lest somebody say, oh, you say police, whatever. I don't know, I love the police. And I want the police to be somebody I can have faith in. And I have to have faith that if one of the police officers, for instance, when I was in high school, there was a younger police officer in Emporia who responded to a young lady who had been raped, called the police, and he raped her again. Now, thankfully, he was arrested, by the Kansas Highway Patrol and prosecuted and sent to prison. Okay, but if that doesn't happen, I mean, if it doesn't happen, then we lose faith. Okay, and particularly when we see that on the national news, we see that the news media is told that Laquan McDonald is injuring police officers and they had to shoot him. And then we see the video that shows that that's not anywhere close to what happened. Then we lose faith. And it hurts all police officers. The 95% who do a good job, who work hard to help us live in a clean and safe environment, are adversely affected. Not just because of what Jason Van Dyke did, but because of what all those other officers did. And they said it was justified because he charged it. Okay, so contact your members of Congress. This is a federal legislation. Okay, write letters to the editor. Several of us in this room do that already.
We've been known to.
Support organizations that support sunshine, like the League of Women Voters. Okay, we're having the League of Women Voters in Kansas City is having a sunshine summit. Okay, we're going to talk about sunshine laws, and again, be vigilant. Okay, and understand that when we step up and we say, "Wait a minute, that's not right," even if it's a member of law enforcement, when we step up, we are actually protecting not only our community, but law enforcement. When we hold them accountable to the same laws that we are held accountable to. Okay. As I was researching this, when I was trying to find the punishment for a police officer who files a false report, and it doesn't exist in Kansas or Missouri. But there's a whole list of things that you as a private citizen who files a false police report can get in trouble for. In fact, in Kansas last year, they made most of them felonies. They were misdemeanors. Now they're felonies, which is probably a good thing. Okay.
Yeah, it isn't, I don't know if it's Nebraska or Iowa, one of those states makes it impossible for you to even video a police encounter to show that what is going on.
So,
And so in a sense, we have a cultural issue too, where some folks are adding to the mix in a sense.
yes. So the US Supreme Court has ruled that as long as you are not interfering with the police and their functioning, that you have every right to film what happens in public. What you cannot do is to walk into a house. In other words, you can't follow them into somebody's residence to see what's happening. But anything that happens in public, out on the streets or in a publicly retail business or anything like that, you are, this is the US Supreme Court. However, what you're talking about with the current configuration of the court, there are now some legislation in test cases that are going to try to challenge that. And I'm sure whichever state it is, I honestly didn't look at that part of this. But I personally, if I see a police officer has pulled somebody over, I am much more attentive to how that interaction is going than I used to be. It used to be like, oh, gotcha, sucks to be you, something like that. I am now much more attentive. And now I have not seen anything, and not seen any KCPD or Missouri Highway Patrol or anything behaving inappropriately. But I look at it, I watch them, I slow down, because if I do see something, then I am going to get my camera out and I'm going to film. Okay. And the reality is, and we were talking about this there too, reality is that this style of policing has been going on since probably the early 80s, maybe the late 70s. This sort of swarm and control and all of this stuff. In fact, there's I can't remember the gentleman's name who wrote a book about it, who's now a professor at UCLA, who says, I didn't mean that. like he said, don't put officers at risk. He was talking about drug raids. He said, don't put officers at risk by sending one officer in. When, you know, you're likely to encounter a large group of people who are armed. But he wasn't talking about traffic stops. You know, he wasn't talking about, you know, people who get pulled over because their license plates expired or something and end up dead, you know, because of this whole, the idea of overwhelming force and all that stuff. So in fact, there's one of the movements that's currently underway. It's not here in Kansas or Missouri, and I can't remember where it is. But there are some people who are advocating to get rid of traffic stops altogether. That you have the information that you need, unless they're speeding in a dangerous way. But if their plates are expired or if their turn signal's not working or something like that, you send a ticket to the plate. You know, wherever the plate's registered, you just send them the ticket and they can go to court. They can pay a ticket or they can go to court and say, wait, that wasn't me driving or whatever. And there's kind of a movement to try to reduce the number of police interactions just for that very reason. And so many of these cases are cases where, you know, these three, Tyree Nichols was pulled over for changing lanes without signal originally by a white police officer. Then he ran and then he was captured by the Scorpion unit officers and beat him to death. So that might be a case where had they simply sent a ticket to his house, he'd still be alive. So questions about this class, concerns, screens of language?
I heard a comment the other day said, you know, the police should be, you know, the people are arguing the police shouldn't shoot innocent people and say they also shouldn't shoot guilty.
Right, yeah. I mean, that should really truly be a last resort.
Yeah.
And I don't think it is. I mean, I think the evidence says it's not a last resort.
Yeah. Well, one question I have, and this is me, I don't know how you do this, but a police officer who joins police force, they have good intentions and be a decent soul, but the violence that they experience turns that person into an extremist.
No doubt.
And so 5% that you, I'm wondering how many of that 5% would be people who could have been altered had they had the proper, I don't know, training, evaluation, whatever you want to call it.
The marriage rate, divorce rate among police is much higher because the police are out there and they're seeing mostly bad people and get the impression that the world is bad and that does not work for them.
It's not unlike a war zone. No, you get exposed to violence there and it changes you.
Sure, it does.
And you know, some people can overcome it and some can't.
One of the things, there's some places where there's been some really successful police reform within departments. And one of them, and I want to say Sacramento, I kind of think that's not the right West Coast city, but one of the West Coast cities, maybe it's that one. One of the things that they discovered was that if police were in a single unit for too long, that they experienced the same kind of stuff. So they would literally rotate, you know. So whereas it used to be, you know, in a lot of departments, the guy who's working in property or whatever is the guy nobody trusts to be out on the street. And I can relate to that because I know when I was a Navy corpsman with the Marine Corps, all the guys who distributed the medical supplies were the guys that you didn't trust to actually fix you if you got hurt. And so I know how that works. Okay. Yeah. But that in fact, I'm pretty sure in Sacramento that they'll rotate so that every officer spends time in records, every officer spends time in evidence locker, every officer spends time in PAO. They literally move them so that they don't spend too much time in any one spot. Including undercover work that internal affairs, and so that it makes them, by the way, much better leaders when they get promoted.
But I've turned out 266 student teachers, but there are 10 that I wish because they were dishonest, couldn't show up for work or had other things like that.
Yeah.
I'm not happy with some police administrators because that person below them, they should have known.
Yes.
And Chauvin had over 20-some different professional complaints against him.
Yes.
For police,
Yes.
and yet he was still out there.
And
So
not
I
only
see
that,
a
there's the-
responsibility on the part of administrators to know who's under them and to take their job, but I don't see that being done anymore by the med school. It's not done in education either. You know, but this is a matter of weeding out individuals who should not be there.
Yeah.
And when they go through a college education, they see things a lot wider and are less likely to fall into everyone's bag. And so 3 weeks ago, I was talking with a sheriff officer who does sometimes undercover, so young, a little younger than mine. And all, and I said, we need more college educated cops. And he said, yes, but how are we going to get them? Because we only pay less than teachers.
Yeah,
Okay,
yeah, and
That's-
for full year of work. by the
that's
way.
right.
Yeah.
And yet I see that level of intelligence being needed, and I don't see the
Yeah.
culling,
Yeah.
the gatekeeping.
Yeah.
The gatekeeping that should be done.
You know, there's no doubt, and that's, I think that's an excellent point, is that, there was a time when, police officers were generally college educated, or at least had associate's degrees, there was some college. And that has waned, in favor of a lot of police officers who are former military. A lot of police officers are, you know, people who started in small towns. I mean, there's kind of a path that you start as a volunteer or part-time police officer someplace, and then you know, once they send you to the academy, and once you get certified, then you can go, you know, sort of work your way up. Very much like teaching, by the way, where you a lot of times start at small towns and work your way to the big money in the big city. And yeah, I think that's a real problem. I remember one time I got into a discussion with a friend of mine who our views on teaching and public education didn't quite square with each other. And he was trying to convince me that vouchers really were a good thing for public schools, because it would make public school teachers work that much harder. You know, that this idea that somehow we're all just loafing around, you know, collecting our salaries. Yeah. And he kept saying, you know, if you look at Northern Europe, blah, 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 blah. And I said, okay, let's look at Northern Europe. Guess who the second highest paid professionals are in Northern Europe, in Denmark, in Sweden?
And they take the top.
It's teachers.
They take the top of their graduating class.
Yes, so if you want to start paying me like they paid in Northern Europe, happy to go there, okay? And that's the problem, is too many times we get comparisons that are false. And I think that, you know, looking at, you know, there's a sense that somehow people who are paid by the public tax dollars are ripping off people, you know, that this is a scam, you know, that people, yeah.
That's true of Congress.
Yeah, I was gonna say, there certainly are places where we could look to save tax dollars. But it's not usually the people that are doing the work. I mean, including, by the way, I've worked in both in a school building. And I started as janitor. I went to work in the central administration here in Emporia. Then I got my teaching certificate and I became a teacher. So I've kind of been in all aspects of that. And I've never really seen somebody who didn't work hard. I mean, administrators, janitors, food service people, secretaries, paras, everybody that works over in the central office or dealing with all the stuff. I never saw somebody who didn't work hard. Okay. And this idea that they're just all sitting around taking money. Now, I'm sure there's some examples of that, no doubt. Ronald Reagan's welfare queen. There's one example that you can find that labels everybody. Okay. Same thing with the police. I mean, it'd be very easy to look at Derek Chauvin and say, oh, God, they all suck. Okay. I mean, we could. That would be the equivalency of the welfare queen. Would be look at Derek Chauvin and say, oh, that's what they all are. Okay. But there are some solutions, and I do think training, mentoring, all of that stuff, I think is, and pay, certainly. Oh my gosh, why are they not paid?
I guess one of the things that I found most disturbing, and I can't remember when this happened, but it was in Buffalo probably after the shooting, and they had some demonstrations going on, and you probably saw it. There was a officer that pushed a 75-year-old man.
Yeah, yeah.
And he banged his head on.
Yeah,
And he just walked on.
Yeah,
Okay, so that doesn't compare to the other things that happened. But then when this offer was released, the police stood around and applauded. All
yeah.
that he was there, were gangs of police officers who
Yeah.
were applauding him. That they were, I mean, to me, that
Well-
means there's more than 5%. That's the problem.
No, and I think that's what, I guess that's part of my whole point,
Yeah.
is the 5% represent the ones who we catch on the news.
Right, right.
We see the video of them. It's the 20 or 30% that are writing all the reports. They
Right.
say, oh, no, he was justified, blah, blah, blah. That's what bothers me.
Right.
The people who are probably otherwise good officers
Mhm.
who keep their mouths shut.
Yeah.
You know, those five officers be
Perseverators, all for the good to do nothing.
for good men to do nothing, absolutely. Those five officers who beat Tyreek Nichols to death were witnessed by other officers. So why did they not stop it? Why did they, once it happened, why did they not report it? Okay, why did we have to wait till we got video?
Shit, I mean, it's the blue shield, and that's,
Yeah,
and I think there's a whole culture now
yeah,
Yeah,
that it's gonna be very difficult to change.
look what happened to Serpico.
yeah, yeah. In the art, you know, it's interesting. And again, I still have very good friends who are in law enforcement. I mean, you know, particularly park rangers, because I worked at campgrounds for a long time, and they're trained by the state. I mean, they go through all the exact same training highway patrol officers do. And they're equipped and everything, and they are law enforcement officers. And one of the arguments that they put forth is, you know, if you keep holding us accountable, then people are going to quit being cops. And to my mind, like, so we can't hold you accountable, like that gives you carte blanche. To go do, I mean, like, that's not a justice system. You know, that's corruption. That's exactly what it is, it's corruption. But I've seen, you know, particularly in Minneapolis, the president of the police union up there has gone on TV several times and made threats. Essentially, that if you know, if in any way we're held accountable, then, you know, we're going to stop going into those neighborhoods, we're going to stop responding to those calls. And see how you like it.
Well, they shouldn't be responding to domestic calls anyway. That should be a matter of another organization,
Yeah.
social services.
And that's, and there's some experiments with that, you know, of course, they. Horrible choice of words, but that's what defunding the police was.
I know, that's bad
Yeah,
choice.
it's a
But that's
stupid thing.
exactly what it's on.
Yeah, but that is what it means. It means
Yeah.
not defund the police, but
But redivert money.
yeah, but provide accurate funding for what
Yeah.
the police needs. And what the police need sometimes are somebody besides the police officer to show up. And because the police officers are not trained as psychologists, they're not trained to settle family disputes. Other than by arresting people, and that generally results in violence.
Yeah.
So,
You think?
yeah. I mean, that's the number one risk that police officers face, other than their own behavior. The number one risk they face for violence is you're going into domestic dispute.
Yes.
I guess as I think about comparing it to us, I mean, I can understand a little bit. You think about if you're a professor and student complains about another professor,
Right.
you know, you're not gonna say, oh, yeah, he's terrible.
Yeah.
There's an unwritten law, you don't. You
Yeah.
don't crash another professor. But on the other hand, I think about an incident we had a number of years where there was a professor who I think really behaved completely inappropriately. And the faculty did not support him at all, as far as I can tell.
Right.
You know,
Yeah.
for sexual harassment or something that was going on in part of the incident,
Well,
but I don't think any faculty.
And I think there's a difference between a student, I mean, you know, we've all had students who, in one way or another, have said, oh my gosh, I love your class, blah, blah, blah. Do you teach LA4? Do you teach the next class? And, you know, and you're like, no, Mr. Williams says that.
Right.
Sorry, you hate Mr. Williams, you know, he's a friend of mine. Okay. We're colleagues, you know, I'm sorry. Now, if Mr. Williams, if I see Mr. Williams in a classroom alone with a student doing something that's inappropriate.
Exactly.
Yeah.
He's
It
no.
would be completely different. If
Yeah.
a student came
I
to
am turning
me,
him in. I'm,
came to me and said, Professor Williams.
yeah,
tried to kiss me inappropriately,
Yes.
then
Yeah.
I'm not gonna say, oh, come on, this is.
Yeah. Ironically, Mr. Williams is now serving time in state penitentiary.
Yeah.
Mr. Williams at Gray Estate now.
So I think that's a fair comparison. I mean, the fact that, I mean, there's probably a lot of cops who don't like other cops for a variety of reasons.
Right.
Okay. But that's very different from somebody covering up illegal activity.
Yeah.
And that's, I think that we need to make that very clear.
There is a public attitude. As a teacher, I remember the first year outside in the hallway during passing period, fight. I go out, 2 boys are going at it. I pick which one is going to stop and I pin the other one against the wall. So he stops and send a student to the office to get the principal.
Yeah.
Today, I cannot do that. I have to wait for 5 minutes for the security officer to come. So that kid gets beat up for another 5 minutes.
Yeah.
Okay? There's something wrong there too.
Yeah. Well, I remember there was a cartoon posted in the teacher's lounge that I thought said it best. It said, I don't know, 1965 or something.
Yeah.
And it showed the kid with an F on paper. And the teacher and the parent were pointing at the kid.
Yeah.
And then it showed in 2015. The
Parent and the kid when you.
parent and the kid are pointing at the teacher.
Right.
What are you gonna do about this?
Yeah.
Except you can't give an F and half schools.
Yeah. Yeah, I think it's probably, I think they were glad I retired when I. That was hitting the Cameron School District. And the person from DESI's, the Northwest RPDC, who, by the way, I'm gonna reveal a little bit about myself. I have a personal animus to being lectured by a grade school teacher about how to deal with high school juniors.
You do.
I do. And I say that my mother and my wife are both grade school teachers, so I think I love grade school teachers, don't get me wrong. But I would no more tell my wife how to handle her grade school classroom than she would tell me how to handle mine. She was just, it's if you put 1 0 in the grade book, it's just does so much damage to their guns. And some of these kids, blah, blah, blah. And I'm like, so what you're saying is you don't give me enough credit for my professional discretion to know that the kid who is an IEP kid who's working his butt off, that you think I'm going to go put a 0 in the grade book for him? Hell no, I'm going to work with him from here till the moon to try to get him to understand. I'm going to put a 0 in the grade book for that kid who just told me to F off. That I can't do anything. Well, yeah, I can.
So is there any place where they're trying to actively come up with policies to address specifically the paper whipping, as far as not necessarily in a murder case where, here's a guy who's arrested, who's murdered. Of course, that gets a lot of camera, a lot of investigation. But I mean, it kind of might mean that there are lots of more minor ones, but on the other hand, the fact that they're willing to lie to support somebody.
No, and I think that
So are there any districts that are saying, if you do this, 5 times, this is what's going to happen. If you do this 10 times, is any place just trying to see if a policy would work?
So again, this is where the George Floyd Act comes in, because right now there's absolutely no reporting requirements at all. None. Okay, so we have no data, and again, that report that I brought up, the only data they got was out of the news. Those were news media things that made it into the paper. Okay, so there was no reports from police departments, no reports from even, the KBI or anything like that. So what this is requiring is that agencies that have arrest power, and it's a whole long list of them, because including tribal agencies and whatnot, because there's a lot of different type of law enforcement, university, like in states, officers and things like that. All this huge long list that if they have arrest powers, that they would have to file reports. Now, which by the way, they already do. That's the thing. I mean, the police officers, I don't know if you've ever done a ride along. When I was with the Employees for Drug Awareness, I did ride alongs periodically on Friday nights. It's real exciting. because there's not a lot that happens in Emporia, believe it or not. But boy, they all respond when it does. Okay, so, I mean, we spent most of the night racing from one side of town to the other to get there and have them say, oh, no, it's all taken care of. Okay. But they write all of that stuff down. The communication with the dispatchers is all computer generated. I mean, it was funny when I was looking at these reports, some of these reports were written like third grade handwriting. But then you get to the dispatcher part and that's all computer generated. So it was all nice and easy to read, all that stuff. And then you get back to the handwritten parts and stuff. And sometimes it was printed and then people were writing over the top of it and stuff. So they do a lot of paperwork. Police do a lot of paperwork. If you ever see a police officer sitting in a parking lot or whatever, that's what they're doing, trying to catch up from the night before's work. That's almost every time I rode with officers, the first 2 hours we sat someplace writing up yesterday. Okay, so they're there. It's a question of whether somebody is looking at that and putting it in data form, pulling the data out of it and putting it into a database, spreadsheet, something that can be then used to see where problems might exist. Because right now we just have no way of knowing.
But one thing that always gets me, I've seen this numerous times around town, 2 police cars are
Yeah,
talking to one.
yes,
And I can understand they need brakes,
yes.
but by the same token, I think it's a bad public perception.
Well, the other thing, and there is a risk to that behavior too, because one of the other things that happens sometimes is that they are agreeing on what happened.
Get their stories.
Yes. You know, one of the things I grew up a fan of Columbo and you know, actually Hercule Poirot and Sherlock Holmes. And one of the very first things that you learn is that if you have a group of people engaged in illegal activities, you separate them. Okay, you don't want them working together on what the one story will be. So you immediately separate them. But obviously, you know, police don't do that with themselves.
Of course, Columbo and Perot are not exactly realistic, but that's okay.
No, although the Columbo method was used to catch the DC sniper.
Really?
Yes, the police chief, who the black police chief kept going on the air. They literally call it, it is listed in police procedurals as the Columbo method, which is to act stupid. Like, oh gosh, we have no idea this guy's really kind of gotten.
Yeah.
I think he's going to get away with it. Blah blah blah. And that is credited with the writers, you know, William Lincoln and Dick Levinson for coming up with that approach. That, you know, we're going to kind of rope dope, if you will, and then spring it on the end.
So do you know that in the places where police officers routinely videotape whatever they're doing, is there any procedure to just kind of look over those even when there's nothing?
So one of the things that I thought was kind of fascinating was the, you know, because two of these incidents, the Corn McDonald and Derek Chauvin, there were several officers whose cameras were recording.
Right.
And they do actually talk about, you know, recovering that in storing, you know, putting it into digital storage and whatnot. I know with the Derek Chauvin, one of the officers was not, his camera didn't work. It could not get it to download any information. But Derek Chauvin's was working fine, and it was. But again, the public, the PAOs, the media release by the PAOs was done after that had happened, and they still said something that was completely wrong.
But I guess I'm saying, I mean, I understand
Yeah,
the
yeah.
profile case there, but it seems to me like there might be some educational value
Yep.
to just routinely looking, you know,
Yeah.
particularly a new officer.
Yeah.
They may have routine traffic stops.
Yeah.
Somebody looks at their video, more experienced officer and
Yeah.
says, here's what you did wrong.
Yeah.
Or something
Yeah.
like that.
And you know, I mean, I come from the Navy, and I mean, particularly in the air wing, every single launch and every single capture is recorded.
Right.
And every single time the pilot sits down with the air boss and his squadron commander, and they go over what you did right, what you did wrong.
Right.
When I was at boot camp, I mean, we all saw the Oriskany just about burn up because they weren't using foam and water correctly, you know, yeah, video is a tremendous teaching tool. I mean, you know, so, but I didn't, it's really hard to find out what actually happened in the training.
Yeah.
There's, I can give you a list of classes that they take, you know, the different, you know, constitutional law classes and things that are given to police officers, but to actually go in and say, here's what it is. The only thing I can tell you is that, I think on Tuesdays and Wednesdays at about 2 o'clock in the morning, the police academy is up the road from where I live, and I think they practice high-speed highway driving with their lights. I've been perhaps on occasion having trouble sleeping and have been taking a sedative out on the balcony with a couple of olives and have observed. They go whipping by, 30 minutes later, they go whipping back the other way. So that's really the only thing about their training.
You know, one of the things that is a concern for me is, you know, you got, for instance, the policeman who is writing the report up
Yes,
in his car the next day or whatever. Is anybody checking to see how accurate it is?
fine. And again, I think that's what this act is going to, you know,
Yeah.
the minute I know somebody's actually reading the report, I'm gonna pay a little more attention to what I write in it.
Yeah.
I write for publication and I write for myself. And promise you, I'm much more careful about what I put in the essays that I write for publication than the ones that I'm doing for my own benefit.
Yeah.
It's partly because I have a really dark sense of humor, and so.
Do we have any idea of how paper whipping is taught? You know, is it mainly anecdotal or is it intentionally, you know, here's how you do this, you know, I'm saying, because, you know, like, I once was part of an interview process of somebody who was incarcerated for a long time, and they said, did they teach you how to bid, or did you put it on your own?
Yeah.
So there might be a synonymous exercise there.
So one of the things that I will say that I discovered as I was looking at 3 different departments' police reports is how many common phrases there were in those reports. So I would say clearly there, which is, by the way, not necessarily a bad thing. I mean, as long as the phrases accurately reflect what happens. But clearly some of them didn't. But yeah, there was one phrase that what was it? That the officer responded for security of the body and traffic control. That was something that in all 3 of these cases that some of the officers who were writing reports, including, by the way, 815R, which got there ahead of Jason Van Dyke. So those 2 officers both used that phrasing, that they were there for security of the body and traffic control.
It's like collusion to be.
Yeah.
So that brings up another point. So if do they have access to each other's reports? The reason I ask is, you know, it's a real temptation. If you've got 10 reports to write, and you know there are 10 different instances, and you know some people have already written down 8 of them. If it's easy for them to access and copy and paste, that's got to be a huge temptation, right? Because I mean, I'll be here all day with this paperwork, but
Yeah.
I was at the same place, and that sounds about right.
Yeah.
I mean, is there any? I mean, that would be easy to check and detect, but
Yeah.
you would, you know, word
No, in
search.
fact, I would argue I maybe detected some of it.
Yeah, yeah, right. So
You know, yeah,
it's like that's the would be easy.
yeah. And again, if this stuff was then being forwarded, if it was being digitized and forwarded to where
Yeah.
you could see, if you put it on a spreadsheet, I mean, just do it alphabetically, all that stuff would show up right together. And if you see it from different departments and, whatnot, then there's, then somebody's being taught that.
Could there be some use of the document dump strategy where the sheer volume of these reports is such that no one's going to read all that?
Right.
That if what was required was actually quite a bit shorter,
Yeah.
it would be far more likely that someone would not only read it, but that they wouldn't zone out and stop paying attention
Well,
halfway through
Yeah.
reading.
I've got 2 thoughts on that. One is that I remember the skipper on the ship that I was on. Not the skipper, my division officer, the surgeon for the ship. Whenever the skipper would call down or send the memo, he would get the memo and he'd put it in his top desk drawer. And at the end of the week, you throw them all away. And I'm like, look, those are things we're supposed to do. And he says, no, I keep them for a week. And if the skipper calls me about one of them, then I dig the memo out and I say, yeah, we're working on it. And he said, it cuts down on our workload tremendously. Then we can take care of the sailors on the ship. And I thought, well, that's kind of brilliant, but but it's also, could we get in trouble, But the other thing, in terms of sheer volume of things, I've noticed that when I go to the doctor, and I have a lot of doctors because I'm old and fat and healthy, that over the last 5 years, they have gone from writing out things by hand to clicking off of menus. And the eye doctor in particular, because I can see her, like I'm sitting here and the computer is right here, I can watch her. I mean, it's amazing, like how fast she can get exactly to what she wants. That's me, that's
They
my,
call it macros all the time.
yeah. So, no, I think the police can learn a lot from this, with this unification of, which happened actually as a function of Obamacare, this idea of consolidating the language and practice of medical reporting. So that, and for very good reason that, if I travel, I get hurt in Minnesota, you want the medical records to look the same no matter where I am. They want the doctor in Minnesota to be able to get the same understanding of my health conditions that my doctor here has. So yeah, I think there's, but clearly it's not happening because I went through, these are all fairly recent cases, and I went through and easily 3/4 of the records were handwritten.
You remember the unemployment debacle in Kansas in 2020 or 2021 when unemployment benefits weren't dispersed when they were supposed to be, and it turned out the computer systems being used from the 1970s and 1980s that haven't been compatible with anything for decades.
Look at the fight they're having over the IRS and upgrading their computers to, so that we can more efficiently handle tax returns.
In my return at the beginning of the month, and they promised that they would send me my refund by the end of the month. I'm still waiting.
Yeah. No, that's, I mean, I think that's, we're always sort of fighting. And part of that is because we're sort of I remember one time I used to do a thing with my students where they, around election time, where they sort of formed parties and they had to have weekly debate about different topics. And one of my students was like, well, why don't we do this? Why don't we do this? And I said, okay, how are you going to make it? He's like, what? And I said, you got to realize that one of the tough things about being in government is that people want you to do all of these things and they don't want to pay for a single one of them. Okay. That's, but that's what taxes are. And so, how do you think he wanted everybody to join the military? I said, okay. And I said, nothing I'm opposed to. I mean, Israel does that. Everybody joins the military in Israel. But let's just look at the, typical year, how many students graduate from high school? What are we talking about? So we just calculations about how many people would be suddenly in the military and how much that would cost.
Well, coach, you split it up between you don't want to be in the military, be in, civilian corps or something like that.
Yeah, no, in fact, he very quickly recognized that some people couldn't be in the military. We had a young man who was multiply disabled and in a guard wheelchair, and how's that going to work? So
obviously that kind of thing, he'd be let out of the bag anyway. So.
Yep. And so that, but it was fun to watch them process through that, that it's not just as easy as everyone thinks. Bob?
Thank you for the presentation and discussion. And Ken has provided some dessert. And we can continue.
And Bob needs to go.
Continue the discussion.
Anyway, so
Thank you, Jim.
Again, March and April, wide open. Okay. So.
Thought you'd appreciate this.
1 second.